Our country is simultaneously becoming more diverse and divided, religiously pluralistic and increasingly secularized, globally connected and increasingly nationalistic. The 24-hour media cycle and social media algorithms reinforce extreme ideologies. What is the role of Christians in this moment? How can Christians be peacemakers within their churches and among the larger society? Amanda Ripley is an investigative journalist and a trained conflict mediator. She's written several acclaimed books, including High Conflict: Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out. Thanks for joining us, Amanda.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here again with you.
Yeah, this world that we live in is so complicated right now, and you've covered a lot of those complexities over time in your work as a journalist and really astute observer of what's going on. I want to get a little bit of your backstory for our hearers of how did you enter into journalism and what compels you as a journalist?
I thought I wanted to work in government. I studied political science and I spent an internship working at the Department of Health and Human Services on welfare reform. And that disabused me of that notion because it seemed like, man, people were working really hard and none of it mattered because Congress ultimately just did what Congress was going to do, which was mostly political, or that's how it felt. So at that point, I was in college. I was writing for the student newspaper, and that felt really exciting and satisfying. And it was at the time in many ways to just be able to create something, to parachute into people's lives and ask them questions and try to tell their stories. It was like an incredible rush and a privilege and a challenge. And I was very lucky early in my career to work for an editor named David Carr at Washington City Paper, who was an incredible, frightening, and wonderful mentor in many ways. So the timing was good and I was fortunate. And it was a very different time in journalism, obviously.
So the time that we're in right now has led you to cover all sorts of stories and reflect on, as an author, the conflicts that we're facing. And I want to draw that out. I mean, when did you really start noticing an increasing or noticeable division in the country, and what was happening from your vantage point?
I think it was really, it's predictable, I guess, but when Trump was running for election in 2016, it started to feel like journalism just wasn't functioning the way it was supposed to function. Most of the places I wrote for, like the Atlantic or the Washington Post, were not trusted by huge swaths of the country. And yet, it's like we just kept doing what we were doing, just only more righteously, I would say. And so we knew that we were fact-checking and we thought that we were trying to be fair, and we just doubled down on traditional journalism, almost in denial about what was happening around us, which was that there was enormous distrust, and some of that for very good reason. And some of it was exploited, by many different people and institutions. So it just felt like, man, anything I might do in this climate, any story I might write was either going to make things worse or have no impact at all, which was kind of unsatisfying and it was disorienting. So I sort of stopped what I was doing and started following people who understand conflict really well to see, like, what am I missing here? Because it was clear we had entered another level of the conflict experience, but it just wasn't making sense to me. And most of all, how to be useful, right, in a time like that. And that was transformative because it allowed me to see that, oh yeah, there's a lot about conflict that journalists don't understand. There's a lot about conflict that I had not understood. And that the kind of conflict you're in really matters. And the kind of conflict that we are in as a country is not typical conflict. It's very different. It's kind of conflict sometimes called intractable or malignant or high conflict. I call it high conflict. And in that state, our brains behave really differently. And any intuitive thing you do to get out of the conflict usually makes it worse. So you have to do really counterintuitive things. And so that was like a lifesaver for me to understand that better. And then to try to figure out how to share those lessons in the book I wrote, High Conflict, but also in the work I do now with a company I co-founded called Good Conflict, where we train journalists and others. So trying to help people see the trap we are in is, I guess, my main preoccupation right now.
I'm going to definitely draw out what this high conflict concept is and the ways that it applies to current moment. But Amanda, you said something that I want to come back to, and that is there are some things that led to the distrust of media that maybe was manipulated, but there were other things that were legitimate concerns. What were a few of the legitimate concerns that you would say led to the distrust?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a long time, like going way back, the media, like, so when I started in it, for sure, but before then, 80s, probably 1980s, it had become, especially national media, had become pretty elite, right? So most of the people I worked with at Time Magazine in New York City were, had graduated from Ivy League schools. And while we had bureaus all over the world, which was really important, there was a kind of ignorance, I think, about much of the country, and sometimes an arrogance. Now, I do think Time was a lot better about that because we were sort of populist in our approach than, say, the New York Times or other places. But you can't know what you don't know. And so if you have a group of people who are homogeneous, whether it's, politically, racially, geographically, you're missing a lot. And so that's one thing that I think is fair. And when people don't see themselves and their values reflected in journalism, it opens the door. It makes people really easy to manipulate with other storylines that may or may not be true. And so I don't think it's entirely to blame, but I think it's part of it. But I think, maybe just as important, and that rarely gets discussed, are the other biases of traditional journalism, including the negativity bias, including the way in which journalism catastrophizes. It helps to expose corruption and misbehavior sometimes, but gives people very little to do about it. So you're left kind of hopeless. And I actually think this is an underappreciated force that has driven a lot of people away from rigorous reporting into the arms of conflict entrepreneurs and others, or just more common, avoiding the news altogether, which 4 in 10 Americans now do. So I just said a lot, so I'm going to stop. But those are some of the things that come to mind.
Amanda, that's really helpful because you're describing the conditions that would permit these seeds of conflicts to be sown and then to come to fruition. And so ignorance, this kind of divide that allows people not to know each other, the catastrophizing, the kind of emphasis on negativity. Now I want to circle back to this issue of what ends up happening in these conditions. You wrote a piece that began with humans carve the world clearly in two when they feel threatened. There's a right, a wrong, a good, an evil, an us, a them. And in normal times, this behavior is most obvious with people who have depression or borderline personality disorder. Psychologists call it splitting. And I think you're contending that what is a disorder in an individual is actually now a disorder in our country, our society. Describe this a little bit more. What exactly is going on with this splitting?
Well, anytime humans feel anxious and uncertain, afraid, right, they will try to find certainty. We all do this. Complexity becomes intolerable. And that's an understandable reaction. And it's comforting to then turn to splitting, to think, okay, now I know there is clarity, there is good and evil, and I am on the side of good. It feels safe, right? And it feels reassuring, and there's solidarity in that to know that you and your group are on the side of the righteous. But it also, like other cognitive distortions, makes us feel worse after it makes us feel better, because we miss things. We make huge mistakes when we do this. So, for example, in the United States, I think it's easy for people who are partisan, and I'm speaking for myself. I'm not very partisan anymore, but I have done this in the past where I've generalized, even in my own head, which is maybe the most important place, about 70 million people who voted a certain way. Like, you think that you know them. There's a kind of trick of the mind where you think you know what they are about, what's in their hearts and souls, which is just obviously impossible, right? More in Common, which is a polarization research firm that does really great work around the world, they tried to divide the American electorate into groups, and the smallest number they could come up with was like 7. Even then, it's just massive generalizations and stereotyping and missing a lot of complexity. But not two groups. But that's what splitting does, is it wants things to be clearer because it feels safer in the short term.
In the short term, so you're implying that past the short term, something happens.
Yes, because eventually when we do this, let's see, there's a quote by Maggie Jackson, who wrote this book, Uncertain. And she said, "When besieged, we tend to raise our mental drawbridges and shut out new information just when it is needed most. The catch-22 is clear. We yearn for clarity when we know least about our predicament. So we mistake our allies for enemies. We miss opportunities. We assume threats that aren't there and miss threats that are there. We know this from a ton of research around the world, but it is truly diabolical when you see it up close, right? Because in this state, we usually end up harming the thing we hold most dear without even realizing it. Whether it's, our kids or our country, it's very easy to make really big mistakes.
The situation that you're describing then, when it's prolonged, is this what you mean by high conflict or intractable conflict?
Exactly, yeah. So where you kind of, the conflict escalates to a point where it takes on a life of its own, right? It's no longer about the thing it seems to be about. It's usually an us versus them. So there's a lot of that splitting that we talked about. You start to feel more and more morally superior to the other side, and also more and more threatened by the other side or the other person. It can be, where the phrase high conflict actually comes from high conflict divorces. So in the 80s, divorce lawyers noticed that about a quarter of American divorces were stuck in perpetual cycles of hostility and blame. And of course, who suffers the most in a high conflict divorce, right? It's always the kids. And that's also true in high conflict politics. So the behavior individually and collectively is actually quite predictable in high conflict. It is becomes a kind of like perpetual motion machine. Like it's hard to interrupt using normal or traditional tools, if that makes sense.
What are those features? What are the predictable stages of this high conflict?
So usually there's 4 triggers that lead to high conflict. I followed people and groups that had been stuck in really ugly conflict of all kinds, political, personal, gang violence, civil war in Colombia, different things. And usually one or all of these sort of fire starters, I like to call them, are present. So these are the things you want to keep an eye out for if you're trying to avoid high conflict, even in your own head, right? So the 4 very quickly are humiliation, conflict entrepreneurs, corruption, and false dichotomies or false binaries. That's that splitting piece that we were talking about.
All right. The humiliation, I think we could all grasp what that is, but conflict entrepreneurs, draw that one out.
So conflict entrepreneurs are people or platforms that exploit conflict for their own ends, right? Often for profit, but maybe even more often for attention, for a sense of power, a sense that you matter in the world, that you belong. All of those reasons are kind of hallmarks of conflict entrepreneurs. It's very easy to be one right now. Like every day I just wake up and try not to be a conflict entrepreneur because we've designed a bunch of our institutions, from journalism to politics to social media, to reward and celebrate and raise up conflict entrepreneurs. And it's easy in a time of fear and anxiety to be taken in by conflict entrepreneurs. But basically, anyone who frames everything as a humiliation might be a conflict entrepreneur, because they're using humiliation, right? If you look at Putin's speech before the invasion of Ukraine, it's sort of laced through with allegations of humiliation. And also people who frame things as us versus them and who force others to pick a side, right? To really reduce the complexity and demand purity and obedience. Those are signs of conflict entrepreneurs. They can also be really charismatic and wonderful in many other ways, but they usually have some kind of internal trouble that they have not been willing or able to deal with. And they are in pain and they are spreading it around in a way that's really dysfunctional and dangerous.
Give us an example. I mean, you as a journalist, author, you've explored this not just in theory, but you've actually explored this in real life examples. Is there an example of a high conflict that would help us get our heads around this in flesh and blood terms?
I mean, there's so many, Walter. Let's see, which one should we choose today? Yeah, I mean, I think one example that comes to mind would be, let's see, I wrote in the book about an environmental activist from the UK who, went into that fight quite earnestly, terrified about what the future would hold for all of us, for our children. And over time got sort of more and more consumed by the conflict itself. And you start to, in this state, do things that you just wouldn't normally do. So he was involved in a couple of different actions that involved destroying crops or, throwing pies in people's faces, different stunts that are designed to get media attention, which does work, obviously, but may not over time work very well. And so there was a couple of incidents where he had one of those sudden flashes of doubt where and we've all had this, right? Where all of a sudden you start to question fundamentally what you're doing and who you've become. It's very scary. But none of those really stuck until at a certain point, somebody challenged him on something he'd written. He was also a science journalist and like sort of on the side. And somebody challenged something he had just written off the cuff for The Guardian. And he was, put off and went Googling around to prove that he was right and couldn't find the evidence that he was right. But because he had started to shift his identity to be more of a scientist, more of a science journalist, his two identities were in conflict, right? His activist identity, where he was splitting, right? And he was part of a high conflict, and also his scientific writer identity, where he was very proud of the way that he was relying on empirical evidence, right? And had been really recognized for that work in the not too distant past. And so that conflict, in a way, created an opening where he could actually contemplate the unthinkable, which was, maybe I'm wrong, or maybe I'm right about some things and wrong about the way that I'm fighting this fight. And he ended up very publicly apologizing to hundreds of farmers at an event in the UK in Oxford that went viral and became sort of sensation, but very brave, uncomfortable, frightening thing to do. And of course, earned him huge enemies from his own side. But he was apologizing for destroying crops and for oversimplifying things that actually weren't that simple and had led to real harm when it came, in his case, to the use of genetically modified food. So it's a longer story, but you get the idea of how he sort of gets pulled into the fight for good reason and then begins to miss things. You literally lose your peripheral vision in high conflict. And that's what happened to him. And also to his great credit, he shifted out of it, which is very hard to do. And then very publicly, he did apologize, which is incredible.
Losing the peripheral vision. I mean, the phrase that people have used for many, many years is, when you're angry, you just get tunnel vision. So, I mean, you're describing this situation in which we just literally, we can't see alternative views. We can't see where we might be wrong. And yet in this instance that you've described, someone did see something wrong and was able to self-correct. And that leads me to the flip side of, okay, we have high conflict. We have these intractable things. We have these kinds of conflicts that are really damaging. But the solution isn't to avoid all conflict. There has to be some measure of conflict in order to see transformation. So how does that shift happen from high conflict to actual good conflict? What are the features of good conflict as opposed to high conflict?
Yeah. So good conflict, healthy conflict can be uncomfortable, right? It can be unpleasant. You will try to avoid it. We all do, usually. There can be anger. Anger, it turns out, in all the research on emotion and conflict, anger is not actually a problem. Anger suggests that if you're angry with me, on some level, you want me to be different. But if you hate me, if you've given up on me, right, that's a very different thing. That's a sign of high conflict. So if you look at them side by side, and we have a graphic to look at if anyone's interested at thegoodconflict.com, where you can download free graphics about all of this and different tools. But one of them shows like side by side. It's like high conflict is characterized by contempt, disgust, righteousness, superiority, and violence is likely. Good conflict is characterized by anger, sadness, fear. All those things are still present, but there's also flashes of curiosity, flashes of understanding, and then back to anger, right? More questions get asked in good conflict, and people emerge from the other side somehow better off, maybe because they're closer. Like if you think about a conflict in a marriage or in a close relationship, if it goes the way conflict can go, you actually emerge closer, right? Like you feel a closeness to that person. Or in other cases, it might be that while you continue to really deeply disagree with the other person, you understand them or the problem or yourself a little better. So you're stronger for it because now you understand it. So those are some of the distinctions. And, probably the biggest takeaway for me has been good conflict is just much more effective. So whatever you're trying to do, whatever fight you're fighting, whatever quest you're on in this short life, if you want it to work and sleep at night, you want to try to stay in good conflict, at least in your own head, because it's going to change how you interact with the conflict. And it may not, you can't change everything else, right? Which is hard. You might be surrounded by people who are in high conflict, but starting there is not a small thing in my experience.
As you've described this transformation of this environmentalist and just the difference between high conflict and good conflict, I'm reminded of the story of the Apostle Paul, who, began life as Saul, persecuting the early church, even breathing threats of death and celebrating the death of early Christian martyrs, even promoting it and pursuing it. And he has that's like the definition of high conflict, literally being murderous in the pursuit of your self-righteous
conflict entrepreneur,
gains.
right? Yeah.
That's right. And then he has this amazing transformation on the road to Damascus that produces this profound ability to question himself and this humility. Instead of humiliation, there's this kind of personal humility. So certainly, as a Christian follower of Jesus, there is this example of redemption that we all could enter into, a story of a conflict entrepreneur that was actually transformed. There are certain features of that story that are remarkably resonant with what you're just describing as the process of human transformation. Of course, there are elements of it that are divinely inspired and quite unique to the religious experience of the divine, but the results are remarkably what you are describing of a greater intimacy that Saul and Paul would have with God, and this humility, this curiosity, the ability to question himself, all these things. Sometimes it requires you to be really knocked down to see this, kind of have this aha moment. For you, when you think about the dire situations that we often find ourselves in our national discourse, what do you think are going to be our aha moments that get us to say, enough, there's got to be a different path?
Yes, this is such a great question. And I love that analogy of Paul. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I often do feel like these stories are somehow divinely inspired, because when you meet people who have made this shift, it is something of a miracle. I mean, it's very lonely to leave high conflict. It is very difficult. Most people who try to leave go back. And usually it's the people in your group, right, who are most upset with you. And it's evolutionarily dangerous, right, to turn your back on your own group. So, and of course, the other group doesn't want you. So you're kind of on your own for a while. But I think, let's see, you just asked me a great question. And I got very distracted.
What would the aha be?
Yeah.
Paul had his aha moment on the road to Damascus. And what would the aha moment be for us in our high conflicts?
One of the people who has taught me the most about aha moments is Curtis Toller, who works at Chicago Cred and on interrupting gang violence. And he himself, by his own telling, was a conflict entrepreneur for many years as a fairly high-ranking leader of a gang in Chicago. His aha moment, right, came when he was watching his young son graduating from 8th grade, and all of a sudden he started weeping in public, which was not something that Curtis Toller did. And so, but he could see that he was either going to be dead or in prison when and if his son graduated from high school. And so his identities also were in tension there, right? Just like with the environmental activist. His identity as a gang leader, which was very powerful as a member of this conflict, right? But also his identity as a father and a husband. So usually when people have an aha moment, it often has something to do with with an undeniable clash in their identities, right? Often to do with their children or their family. So that is one pattern that I saw again and again and again. Even when in Colombia, when people defected from the FARC, which was the largest guerrilla group in that civil war, it was often because of this pull, this pain point around going back to their families. So these aha moments can come at any time for a collective conflict like we're in. They often come when there's some kind of shock to the conflict system. And Peter Coleman at Columbia has written very eloquently on this, but some kind of shock where the system of the high conflict is temporarily disoriented, right? So the plates are spinning in the air. And that could be, with gang violence in Chicago, it could be from a snowstorm. So all of a sudden, no one gets shot for several days, right? And people have a moment to reflect, and they find that, wow, this is kind of nice, right? Imagine if this went on and on. Other times it's because in a high conflict divorce, because a child gets sick, let's say, or in high conflict politics because violence happens, right? So these things often happen, and then nobody shifts out, right? And that's because they don't know where to go. So the pitch I always make to folks is who are worried about our country and the various conflicts that are consuming our loved ones and our neighbors is to prepare for that moment in advance. And if you can, try to stay in relationship so that people who are ready to leave the high conflict have somewhere to go. And this is hard to do, and it's not going to work for everyone. But, Curtis estimates that 80% of the people in high conflict in Chicago would want to leave, but no one has invited them out. So that's what Chicago Cred does. They don't feel like there is any path. And I just had this conversation with some high-level political staffers here in D.C. and was just urging them, look, you need to prepare. There's more violence coming, unfortunately. Every predictor we have of political violence suggests that we're going to see more of it. We've already seen a big increase in threats, in actual violence, targeted violence, political violence, at the state and local level, at the national level. Often, by the way, intra-group, so Republican against Republican, right, is the most common kind right now. So when those things happen, you have like 48 hours where you can make some kind of turning point in this conflict. And then it goes back. It snaps right back, right, to the high conflict. So you have to really prepare for that, be ready, work on proposed rules of engagement, non-aggression pacts, things we're going to agree to do in the conflict going forward. Invite people in advance. Hey, do you want to do this conflict differently? Do you want to do it differently for your own kids? People who have influence over the conflict. That is what Curtis spends a lot of his time doing, is inviting people who create a lot of mayhem and who have been the victims of a lot of violence to do the conflict differently.
So you've described things that include the aha moment, getting out of it, and then other conditions that are necessary, having a plan, non-aggression pact. But I want to pull out a little bit more on the relationship aspect, because you're indicating up to 80% would, if they had someone inviting them out of it, would in fact consider that and even pursue it. But when we're so tribalized and we don't have these relationships across these divides, then what do we do?
Yeah. I mean, it's really hard because we are really segregated right now in a way, politically, in a way that we weren't for most of my life and yours. I do think it's worth noting that a lot of the most upsetting conflict today is coming within the group. So you might have a cousin who's way out on the right or way out on the left, or who believes in what you think are conspiracy theories, right? Or maybe it's over something else entirely. Maybe it's not about politics. Maybe it's about your parents' will. I don't know. We all have examples like this. And so it's sometimes, yes, good to have relationships across these divides. That's super important. And that is how we keep ourselves in check, right? It's much harder to degrade, dismiss, and dehumanize someone who you know, right? Who you know is a complicated three-dimensional human, right? Who you think has some ignorant views in this one way, but is also like incredibly kind to the kids that he coaches on the football team or whatever it is. So that complexity is so powerful and keeps us from making really awful mistakes with one another, right? And also within our group, that is in some ways harder, I've been talking with some groups who are in active warfare with each other. And it's actually, interestingly, that internal conflict within their own groups that is really tearing them up, even though that is less deadly, right, physically. But spiritually, morally, socially, it is deadly. And they feel it. And so, to my surprise, that's what they want to talk about. Less about the actual war, which obviously is on their mind all the time, but it's that internal conflict that can really eat away at you. So it's I guess all of the above, like relationships across divides, but also within groups.
So, as groups are internally, I guess, cannibalizing the conflicts within. You mentioned this conspiracy theories that separate us into these ecosystems of information. In your experience, when there is this moment of self-questioning, internally, you've lost your footing, you're no longer in the in with your own in group, do people actually reach out and try to make new connections? In other words, I'm really wondering, who is it incumbent upon? Is it incumbent upon others who are bridge builders to actively be looking for those who might be at a point of questioning because they've been rejected by their own group? Or is there enough like activation energy from those who have been rejected in their own group, enough kind of wherewithal or even information to go find another place to find a connection?
That's such a good question. I know I'm not supposed to do this, but I'm like really curious to hear what you think. I feel like you have a theory.
Well, I think there's a little bit of both, Amanda, right? That when there's a desperation that we feel, and I think about my work as a pastor for many years, there comes a point of humility where you're beginning to say, I am not enough. The group that I'm in is not enough. I need to reach back out. It could be reaching back out to a memory of something, before. And I think of the story of the parable of the two sons that Jesus tells. The second son who wants this inheritance, and he gets it from his father, and he goes squanders it in a life of disillusion, and he's like sitting in this pig pen, and he's coming to his senses. Like, oh, even the servants in my father's house have it, better. Maybe I can go back. So there is this story that Jesus tells that appeals to the fact of, we all probably have some relationship that we can hearken back to and try to reconstruct the hope that we have, that maybe there is a solution. Of course, I would offer that the church ought to be that, but it's complicated because the church often is a part of the problem, and we have to acknowledge that. But there is something of that, I would say, Amanda, that there's a relationship that we can come back to, a memory, an instinct of a better self. You noted the gang leader who thought about his son, and I would imagine there was teachers or others in his son's life that the person could reach out to. But my real concern is that those who have long sought to be bridge builders would be losing their nerve because of the repeated like rejections of attempts. And in some ways, I would love to see this revitalized courage for those who are skilled at not being conflict entrepreneurs, but being bridge builders, conflict healers, and not to lose their nerve in this moment and to feel like because the media comes back to this refrain that, oh, this is an intractable situation. It's so horrible, catastrophizing. I think there are many who could be these healers that give up because they think it's just not going to work, because they've seen the really horrible examples of people being canceled or rejected. And part of my hope is that we encourage and give courage to those folks to continue to reach out. Amanda, does that resonate or with the stories that you've explored? And is there hope for this hope that I have?
I think that's beautifully put. I think I actually do have hope, and I might be wrong, but I do feel like people are so fatigued by the way we've been in this conflict that there's an unusual hunger for something else. This isn't always true, and it depends on the room. And you have to know your own spheres of influence, right? Know that it's unlikely that you're going to be able to build a huge bridge across an ocean right away. But you could start with a small step, like build a bridge in your own community, in your own circle, among the people who trust and know you. That's going to go better. So I think starting there makes a lot of sense, particularly because when you're in high conflict, nothing you say is going to persuade the other side. It's just not how it works, right? And this is what I struggle with when I'm training journalists. We've trained over 500 journalists in how to cover conflict differently through good conflict. And, some of this is like an ego check, like recognizing that you can't actually convince people that what they believe is false. Like that's people who don't know or trust you. Even if they know and trust you, it's very difficult, right? So can we instead start with the people we know and love? Can we show 10% vulnerability of our own? This is what we train folks in leadership positions to do right now. Your instinct when you feel attacked or when you feel someone is dangerously misled is to be super decisive and authoritarian and never let them see you sweat. But in fact, if you can show yourself to be a human who is unsure, who has made mistakes, who loses sleep at night over this relationship, you will make it possible for that other person to do the same, right? So if that's genuine. So 10% humility, starting with people that you know and care about, gives you somewhere to go, and really preparing for that conversation. It's striking to me how if you were going to give a toast at a wedding or a eulogy at a funeral, you probably wouldn't just wing it, right? Like you probably would spend maybe hours preparing for that. And so when we do workshops, we work on walking people through step by step how you prepare for that. And you don't want to wing it. You want to practice it. You want to practice it out loud even. You want to do it in person or on the phone. And you want to keep really clear what your goal is. Like, is your goal to strengthen this relationship, to understand this person a little better, even as you disagree? Those are good goals. If your goal is to persuade or to punish, you're likely to make things worse. So getting really clear on that. And I guess I would just finally say, we know from the research that when people preemptively and publicly condemn all acts of political violence on their own social media feeds, it does reduce the odds of political violence. Would it be great if politicians did that and if famous people did that? Yes, it would. That helps too. But even, the research shows, even in your own circle, when you say no matter what happens this election season, there's never cause for violence, it helps. It helps because we're trying to rebuild and shore up the norms, right, of civilization here. And violence is the thing that I worry most about because once it gets going, it's really hard to stop. And it's really hard not to fall into high conflict, understandably, right, because you're frightened. So that is a real clear line that I feel like most of us could agree on, right? And could say publicly, even if you think it's obvious, why should you have to say it? Well, say that. Say, I feel like this should be obvious. And yet, I just want to say, no matter what happens, violence is not okay. We Americans should not resort to violence. I mean, it is kind of incredible what we will be throwing away if we do.
The resources that you're describing to be prepared, when these moments come, you've mentioned the resources that you and your group have provided. You've also written about some other places like the Difficult Conversations Lab at Columbia. Point to some of these things, describe some of these things so that we could be equipped, so that our listeners could say, I know where to go to help me create and craft a response when the moment comes.
Yeah. So Braver Angels is a group that many people may have heard of, but it's one of the larger bridging organizations around the country. There's chapters all over the country where you can go to workshops where they help kind of build the skills, right, of how do we talk across a political divide. And it actually did have the effect when I went to one years ago of making me much more curious about myself and the other side than I had been. And you find you kind of like yourself better afterwards. Like you like showing up in that way of being, convicted, but open and surprised, able to be surprised, right? That is the feeling we so rarely get now. But Braver Angels is a good one to look for and see if there's anything happening in your area. Another thing that we spend a lot of our time on is helping people learn to do like a tactical listening technique called looping. There's others out there. Any listening training you can get, take it. Because what I found is you never finish learning. Listening well, so people really believe you are trying to understand them, is an intellectual and emotional challenge of the highest order. And I will be working on it until the day I die. So that is something I highly recommend. And the last thing I would say is to look around, search your area, search Google for crisis de-escalation training. So that can be really empowering and helpful and just interesting. Like, it's interesting in ways you wouldn't expect. I've done it several times. Again, every chance I get, I'll do it. And while that's more of an immediate crisis where you're, at a polling place or at a supermarket or on an airplane and things are about to get violent, what do you do, right? It is really good to know what to do in those situations and to practice it in a low stakes setting. And it made me less afraid, It made me feel like, okay, while there are lots of things I can't intervene on, there are some things I can and have, right? And actually the lessons of crisis de-escalation, if you stretch them out, are the same for high conflict, for long, broil, serious conflict that stretches over years and years. It's a lot about slowing down the conflict, showing people they've been heard, building rapport or ideally relationship if you have time, and asking questions. Like, the formula is strikingly similar, whether it's a slow motion political conflict or an immediate, potentially violent conflict. So those are some of the actions that I would suggest taking if you can. And I'd love to hear about it if anyone does any of these things and has lessons to share about what did or didn't work. And you can reach me at info@thegoodconflict.com.
That is so good, Amanda. Once again, I think there are all these resonances between what you're describing as these processes and the work of Jesus. I mean, he did a lot of these very things. He asked questions. I think of the numerous interactions he had with people across these divides, whether it was, a woman caught in adultery, or whether it's someone from a different ethnic group. I mean, his conversations were peppered with questions, and was also with people in religious positions of power, Pharisees and Sadducees. He's often found asking questions, and this fundamental a desire not just to win an argument, but to actually meet people in their needs, in their humanity. Certainly, the Christian message would be for Christ and meet them for the ultimate vision of redemption. But there is something very human in his interactions that you've marked out that I would certainly say for those who listen to this, it is not just a matter of social science. It's a matter of example that the scriptures actually lay out for how Jesus navigated these conflicts in his own orbit.
I feel like we should take this show on the road, Walter, because you have this knowledge that I don't have. I'm not going to pretend that I do. My family is Catholic, my husband and my son, but I do not know as much as you do or they do about the Bible, about Jesus, about Christianity. And I'm a little embarrassed to admit that, but I also just want to thank you for helping me see connections that I didn't know about. That's my own ignorance, right? And so... and that makes so much sense to me. And some of that I do know, but I don't know, you're able to explain it in a way that just clicks and makes so much sense. So thank you for that.
We all have these moments. This will be my last question to you. We all have these moments, Amanda, where we just think, is this really worth it? What do you tell yourself in those moments?
I always know it's worth it. I guess my darkest moments are when it feels like there's nothing I can do. You know what I mean? Like there's this, you're just barreling towards the darkness. And it's like watching a train wreck, and you're watching your city or your country or your people, your profession, whatever it is, just descend into this pit of despair. And that hopelessness is really hard. So I'd say for me at those times, I always try to, I mean, I don't always succeed, right? But I try to actively widen the lens to see, what am I missing? Because there are a lot of people working really hard to try to rebuild trust, to try to protect what is sacred in our communities. You know them, I know them, and continually trying to refresh my brain, like the way you do when you reset a website or a computer. Is like you have to do that over and over and see a fuller picture and take a longer view, right? Because it is the worst feeling to feel powerless. So I guess for me, trying to stay in that place of openness starts with internal work, so that requires me to do a bunch of things that are really kind of time consuming, and I wish I didn't have to do, but it requires me to, in my case, meditate every day for like 10 or 15 minutes. For other people, it's prayer. I also exercise every day. Like there's just basic things I have to do to keep myself seeing a fuller picture, and also limiting my news consumption and trying to really be very, very thoughtful about where I am placing my focus. And that is a constant challenge, I think, for all of us today. How do we stay informed and be good citizens without descending into negativity and despair? So the Christian Science Monitor is one of my favorite news outlets these days, because I feel like they have always done this thing where they do stories on really hard things, war and famine and misery and school shootings, all the things. But there's something about the way they approach it where you feel like they're rooting for humanity. You know what I mean? Like it's really subtle, but there's something about the way they are telling the story, including the fact for every story they have a little box that says why we wrote this, and they explain why they're covering it. So they're doing a bunch of things to be more transparent and to avoid that pit of despair, and give us a bigger frame, which is really helpful.
Wow. Thank you, Amanda. You have given us a ton to reflect on. It's really been helpful.
Thank you for having me. I always learn so much from talking to you. So thank you.